Good evening, Joe. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Let's start with the weekend then. La Rochelle against Toulouse at Twickenham. Toulouse beat Bordeaux on the Saturday, and then O'Gara. I mean, I'm surprised he wasn't jumping the hoardings again. Incredible. 32 points to 23 against Leinster. So, overall take on this game. La Rochelle won this more than Leinster lost it, or a bit of both?
No, I think the former. La Rochelle, very, very good in the second half. Leinster didn't help themselves. Um, they just, I don't think it was as bad as Saracens, but it did feel a bit like their Achilles heel coming back again, where that really physically dominant pack, beating up our pack and stopping any source of possession, and then doing so much damage with ball in hand, came back again at us. And if you look at some of the ball carriers that La Rochelle had, Skelton was unbelievable. Antonio played for 65 minutes. He's 23 stone. And looked as fit as anyone else out there. Aldrit was brilliant. Burgery, their hooker, was outstanding in carrying and making nuisance of himself at the ruck. So lots of different factors kind of worked against Leinster, on top of them shooting themselves in the foot a little bit. Like they left a couple of gilt-edged chances out there. And these games are all games of momentum. And you have to ride the purple patch of the opposition. You got to take your chance when they present themselves, and when they're few and far between, you have to make them count. And Leinster didn't manage to do that and never got any momentum in the second half.
Because Leinster started well. La Rochelle gave away 5 penalties in the first 10 minutes. Leinster were up by a point at the interval. What was your sense of the game then?
Yeah, obviously they looked very physically dominant. They made a shambles of multiple kickoff receipts. Dylan Lades couldn't get the trajectory of the ball in the sun, which I'm sure he's well used to playing in, but for some reason he just couldn't get it, and it gave Leinster access deep into La Rochelle territory, and they were patient. The first 5 or 6 minutes, the referee lost his patience with Liebenberg, sent him to the bin, and it was no more than Leinster deserved at 7-0. But they just kind of, La Rochelle never went away, and they never put that early possession and territory, into points on the scoreboard. They should have been a couple of scores up. They shouldn't have, let La Rochelle can eke their way back into the game. They got a line-out drive, and then they kicked a penalty, and all of a sudden it's 7-3 when they've barely had a touch of the ball. So there were small little things like that kind of hung over, and you thought, gosh, they really need to make this count, because what the potential of that La Rochelle team is, which we subsequently got for the next 60 minutes.
And what changed in your view? Because for anyone who's just looking at the scoreboard, 32-23, I mean, it's a very good win, but it was actually really double scores into the last kind of 10 minutes. Ross Byrne scored that late try, which almost felt kind of consolation territory. So what did La Rochelle do in the second half that Leinster just couldn't cope with?
Yeah, I think the scoreline probably ultimately in the end did flatter Leinster a small bit because of that late score. At the ruck, I've never seen Leinster so exposed at ruck time. Their hooker Burgery must have had 2 or 3 turnovers. Dylan Lades got one. Antonio got one. They were all picking up turnovers, and when you can't get any fluidity to your game plan if you're turning over ball after 3 or 4 phases. And one of La Rochelle's biggest attacking weapons was their line-out, because of their line-out maul and because of the power and size of them, even though they weren't brilliant throughout the whole game. But even when Leinster disrupted the line-out and got the ball back, their exits from that, they just kicked the ball directly back to them, or kicked it into touch and gave them another opportunity at it. So it felt as though there was probably a bit of lack of control at halfback. I was trying to wonder whether things would have been dramatically different if Jonathan Sexton was at 10. I think there would have been, his experience, he would have known how to kind of manipulate the La Rochelle defence, which was incredibly good for the whole game. But it just felt as though they were flying off the line, and they needed to be checked a little bit. They needed a little dink in behind, like La Rochelle did to Leinster. They needed to kick, go for another 1 or 2 kick passes just to make sure that their wingers were holding reasonable width. None of those things were challenged.
Okay.
Whereas, conversely, La Rochelle had massive range to their game. They obviously had the huge power play up front, but Ohio West had an armchair ride. He was, picking his passes. He was, kicking to veto out on the touchline, and then, he was kicking his goals on top of that. So it just felt like a real no errors sort of game plan. Other than those initial 10 minutes from La Rochelle, they didn't do an awful lot wrong. Defended stoically. Their willingness to get up off the ground and present extra bodies in the front line, not have any dead bodies lying on the ground, was a real point of difference. And conversely, Leinster were having to recycle ball with 3-4 players in each ruck, and straight away it was a numbers game advantage, La Rochelle and the defensive line, and that's where the line speed came from. So there were so many different aspects that you could kind of retrospectively pull apart, but it was a very frustrating day for Leinster, because they got beaten up, but they had chances to put themselves into a place where momentum would have counted. They gave up try-scoring opportunities just before half-time. Larmer made a break down the touchline and threw a poor pass to Luke McGrath. And then right after half-time, Ryan Baird, it was kind of a bit of a nothing play. A ball got batted down and he came galloping through and got an arm through a stray ball. If that sticks, to try in the corner, and it's 2 scores ahead. So these things are key in semi-finals. And La Rochelle rode their luck in that regard, and then just built momentum and squeezed the life out of Leinster.
So if we were to try and look for some common traits in Leinster's failings in the last couple of Heineken Champions Cup matches, knockout matches, this one and then the 2 against Saracens, and admittedly the middle Saracens one, they just killed Leinster at the scrum and were open at a lead, and it gets very, very difficult then. But the thing people would say from afar is these big physical teams, Leinster have a bit of a problem with. How much of it is down to size and power here, in your opinion?
There's definitely an element to it, no doubt whatsoever. But I think good teams are able to get beyond that too. And I just don't feel as though they played to any space. Now, they weren't, in many ways, they weren't allowed through ball in hand. But if you're not allowed to do that, if there's a rush defence coming from the outside, you've got to be able to find that space with the boot. And a kick pass, a flat 20-metre kick pass can be way more effective than three passes out of back line when there's a huge press. But it just didn't feel as though that was ever on the cards. There was one time that Ross Byrne went on penalty advantage to James Lowe, and it was a great kick and just dropped a little bit too far. There's another chance, that drops 1 yard shorter. Lowe catches it full tilt, takes on Bryce Doolan, probably going to beat him one-on-one. There's a score. So as much as you're reading lots of reports, and it's kind of doom and gloom for Leinster because it feels the same as Saracens again, they still had lots of access into the game, into creating opportunities for themselves. And other than the first try, they took the first one and the Ross Byrne one at the end, they took no others. And when La Rochelle were keeping the scoreboard ticking over the way they were with Ohio West goal kicks and his drop goal, and then built on that with the scores, it was a real Munster feel to that. It's what Rog has done for years. 3-6-9 try, and all of a sudden you're 2 scores ahead or 3 scores ahead, and you're kind of thinking, how did that happen? So my feeling is that there's definitely an issue when really physical teams do come up against Leinster, that's for sure. But they have the capabilities of seeing their way through that, but they didn't manage to do that on this occasion. I don't think, if you look at it as well, right?
Yeah.
So semi-final wise, people are saying it feels like Leinster are a mile away from a Heineken final. They're not. You flip that fixture and have it in the RDS. Leinster are comfortable favourites, and they might be able to see it through, and there's home advantage plays a big factor in that. So you're never that far away. If they go out and play La Rochelle again tomorrow, they won't lose to them by 11 points. I really don't think they will. So they just caught them on a day where they weren't firing, that they didn't have big individual performers, even though guys played with lots of spirit, but it just wasn't enough. And I think when you're not controlling things at halfback, it has a big impact on the rest of the team.
Yeah. I like it's perfect cup rugby. If you're La Rochelle and Ronan O'Gara, I mean, we'll talk about that in a second. It's a perfect cup rugby afternoon execution, and you make off into the sunset, and it's a beautiful feeling, I would suspect. I guess the other point you would make about Leinster in this scenario is because their pack is so dominant at Pro 14 level and much of European level as well, they are not overly practiced at playing without parity up front. I mean, Ross Byrne does not find himself in that situation very often. Johnny Sexton tended to find himself in that situation more so with Ireland than with Leinster. So do they look like a team who, you know, once, twice a year find themselves in that scenario and then, I was going to say, like, almost forget to mix it up and have that bit of variety that you're talking about, but you would surely think during the week they're aware things could go that way and they will need to mix it up. So it's kind of hard to make too many excuses for them. But there is something maybe in the point that they don't face this scenario very often across a season.
It does feel, Joe, that it's becoming more apparent. It really does. That unless you find yourself in those circumstances a couple of times a year, and it's very hard to prep yourself for it when the chips are down and when you do come up against it and you've got people a little bit off their game. So, like I said, there's kind of multiple factors at work there. But there is an issue with the Pro 14, and we've said it for a while. We've been trying to promote it as, you know, being it's not so bad. It's a poor tournament, and the quality is very poor. And I think you look at, you know, what the English teams and what the French teams are having to deliver week on week, and even when the standard mightn't be brilliant, even though the Premiership's been very good, the standard's been very good, it's a dogfight. Leinster have won the Pro 14 the last few years at a canter in third gear using 59 players. Like, that just shouldn't happen when you're able to delve that deep into your academy and sub-academy and still, you know, produce try bonuses in almost every game. What are you learning from that? You only learn against better teams, and at the moment, other teams are learning from them and will be getting better as a result. But I don't think Leinster are learning a huge amount, because of the opposition that they are coming up against week in, week out, and until they do get the Stormers and the Sharks and the other South African teams, and they start getting that crazy physicality and the different type of game thrown at them, I think they will get to a plateau level of still feeling that shock when they do get the Skeltons of the world coming at them, or the Atogis or the Vunipolas, which ordinarily they don't get.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Because there's no way they can somehow use the Pro 14 to prepare for that, you know, like let's give them parity up front or something this evening and try and play on the back foot. You just can't engineer those scenarios in a match. You have to face them for real.
Yeah, you know, you can't. But you know, they'll say as well, listen, we had physically imposed ourselves on them in the first 15 minutes, so that Achilles heel is nonsense. But, you know, when you look back, La Rochelle were even, you know, Leinster came out all guns blazing the first 10, 15 minutes and they won the battle. It's very hard to do that for 80 minutes. And even if you watch some of the La Rochelle defence in those early exchanges, it was still very good. And Leinster really had to work hard for it. But then they really grew into the game when they got their hands on the ball a little bit, and they forced indiscipline from Leinster, and they, you know, got the scoreboard ticking. You could just sense that they were very patient with their performance, and that they could go to multiple aspects. Their scrum was very good. Line out was decent for the most part. Really good quality of passing, and their ruck, their annoyance at the ruck, at Leinster's ruck, but the clarity on their own ball. Kerbarlow, you know, challenged the pillar defence and, you know, probed in behind. They didn't throw silly 50-50 offloads. It just felt as though they made way more good decisions than bad, and their execution was very good, countered with, you know, Leinster's execution being very poor at pivotal times.
For O'Gara and for Gibbs, I mean, O'Gara in particular, the hype train goes into overdrive now. This is really impressive stuff all of a sudden, you know. Heineken Champions Cup final, second in the top 14. It's kind of dreamland stuff.
It really is, yeah. And, you know, he'll have taken a huge amount of satisfaction from obviously beating Leinster, you know, because of the history and tradition that he's had with Leinster, but also the knowledge that they've been one of the best teams in Europe for the last 3 or 4 years, and consistently in there, and they know that they've delved into a really great performance to be able to better them. And you know, they go into a final with, you know, nothing to lose. Toulouse are going for their 5th title. They've got all the history there. But you look at that La Rochelle defense, and then the other components that they build their attacking game on. I tell you what, it'll take a really good Toulouse performance to better them in Twickenham in a few weeks' time, because Toulouse are very good. Don't get me wrong, and they can mix it up as well. But the miserly aspect of the La Rochelle defense was really was the point of difference that I kind of came away from the game and thought, wow, I wasn't anticipating really good tackle technique, really good decisions, great line speed, but also being able to cover the backfield. They kind of got everything right. And at one point Leinster had to play deep in their own territory because La Rochelle had, lots of numbers in the backfield, but yet their 12 players in the front line felt like they were doing the job of 14 or 15. So it was a performance definitely built on defense, and then they took their few opportunities very, very well and coasted to a comfortable victory ultimately.